also like to ask Børge Brende and Don Banik to join me for a brief conversation about civil society. Don Banik is a professor of political science and research director at the University of Oslo. He is also consulting scholar at Stanford University and adjunct professor at the China Agricultural University in Beijing. Leave no one behind has been said many times now. And it is a core principle for sustainable development goals. Børge Brende, let me start with you. What do you think is the role of civil society organizations? Are they specially suited to reach the poorest, the most marginalized?
I think I partly answered the question also in my speech, but I'm happy to underline the role of civil society in vulnerable states. I think that in vulnerable states, there is also a lack of infrastructure from the government side. So it can be complementary, and it can also move in and fill a role and the gap there the government is not able or is not present. So in these kind of societies, in vulnerable states and fragile states, a civil society is crucial. And I've seen it myself that a lot of organizations are doing very important and consequential and play a consequential role in these states. When states are moving into a more positive development path, we have to be more focused on making sure that they have a complementary role to the government, because the government has also an obligation to also secure funding by national resource mobilization, taxes, and has a role in making sure that those taxes are also allocated to areas like health and education, and not only for military purposes that we see in some of these countries that is a high priority. And there we're moving into some dilemmas that we have to discuss too, making sure that civil society is not filling the role of what is the government's responsibility.
Yeah, that's what I want to ask you about, Helle. Some countries seem to appear comfortable with civil society organizations providing services for their citizens, relieving them their responsibility. How do you handle this dilemma?
Well, I very much agree with Børge on this. This is mainly the responsibility to provide basic healthcare, basic education. That is mainly the responsibility of any government. And as soon as they have that capability, of course, civil society should not step in. We are very happy to leave systems and ideas, so then they can scale it up, but we should not step in and take that role. And we can't, by the way. We don't have the resources to do that, so what I'm recommending to all governments is that they install their own tax system so they can start funding normal services to their people, normal services such as health and education. But one thing I will say, and I completely agree with Børge, where civil society will still, unfortunately, have a big role is when there's no state to protect people. For example, for the 30 million children that are refugee children right now, what happens to them is basically that where other people have a state to protect them, there's no state to protect them. And that gives us a double role as civil society and other governments to protect these people, because they don't have a state that could do that job, which is normally a job of a state.
But Don, in fragile states, civil society organizations sometimes really have to provide these services. How do they do this without undermining the legitimacy of the state, the authority and responsibility?
So I think the key aspect here really is legitimacy, that all actions by civil society and other actors should be strengthening the legitimacy of the state, because it's not just in fragile states. In many other states that are quasi-fragile, and Malawi would be one of those, you see that, and this is a good thing, that a lot of local people actually trust civil society actors a lot more than they do their politicians and many others in society. But the trouble here is that you don't want to undermine the state too much either. And I'm reminded of my Stanford colleague, Francis Fukuyama, who distinguishes between the scope of states and the strength of states. So in the one sense, you can talk about states as having extensive scope, the kind of domestic and international functions it does. But there's also a distinction between the strength, that is the efficiency to actually implement policy. And that is where, fragile states are in trouble. So I think what we really should be doing is thinking about innovative ways where civil society can promote transparency initiatives. It could be, in some cases, contentious action, and some cases, just being uncivil. There's a contradiction in civil society. I mean, you don't have to be civil. But the trouble being...
That's very interesting. Uncivil in what way?
Well, being uncivil is just questioning and being difficult, being a troublemaker. But the trouble is that when you are a troublemaker, it can lead to violence and all kinds of repression. So that's that fine balance, being, uncivil, incivility in actions, and somehow still being able to create and invent spaces for meaningful dialogue.
Mm-hmm. But you have been working directly in humanitarian work. How do you handle this dilemma when standing there and face to face to suffering? I mean, it's that you are providing services that the state should take care of.
When the state is incapable of doing it, or the state is unwilling to do it, I think the humanitarian imperative is there too. We cannot see and just be spectators to a situation where children and people don't get food, don't get clean water, shelter, and protection. Then we have to move in. But the question is, how to combine this humanitarian imperative with also pressure on the state to take increased responsibility. We have countries where only 7% of GDP amounts to the taxes. And the average for developing countries are maybe 35%. And when they have 8%, and half of it go to military purposes, and we are topping up that, there are dilemmas. But for me, it is not the responsibility of the children in these countries that they have leadership that fails. That's where the humanitarian imperative comes in. But then I think also what Dan said about civil society being really the organizations that can stimulate to a discussion in these countries to get the change in this. Because if you have all the landlords don't need to pay taxes in the country, they're exempted for taxes, then there has to be build up a pressure where people say, there is no reasons why you should not pay taxes. You should pay taxes too and contribute to this. So I think that in every civilized society, you will have a strong civil society. It is something between the individual, and government and society. In that space, we have civil society adding to to make sure that that country also will become a very civilized society. And there are few examples of countries moving out of poverty into being middle-income countries without having also civil society as an important driver of change and driving the country into development. And we've seen this in our own country, but we've also seen this in a lot of other countries that have moved out of poverty. Remember, this country used to be the poorest one in Europe, together with Ireland and Iceland, a little bit more than 100 years ago. So, and I think if you look at what took place here 120 years ago, we also had very strong organizations that were driving these kind of changes.
You shouldn't forget that Sanitetskvinne started the Norwegian Public Health Service.
Yeah.
But Helle, in your speech, you touched upon the change from north to south. Do you see kind of a phase out now of the northern-based organizations, like in Denmark and Norway?
No, I mean, my point was two. First of all, I think even in Norway and in Denmark, there will always be a need for civil society organizations like Save the Children that are speaking up for a particular group in society that have rights. Particularly when it's a vulnerable group that don't have the means or the authority to speak up for themselves. So this is why I think there will always be a need for Red Barnet to actually speak up for children and talk about their rights. In Norway, Norway is a very nice country, but it's not perfect. And the same is for Denmark, so there will be...
I'm glad you added that.
Yeah.
Especially since you left as Prime Minister.
Yeah, absolutely. So there will be a need to speak up for children everywhere. But what we want to do is not only to be an international NGO coming in to the global south and talking for children. That is why our end game is actually to have Save the Children organizations like the ones you know so well in Norway to be on the ground everywhere in the world. Save the Children India, Save the Children South Africa, Save the Children Philippines. We already have one, Save the Children Jordan, which is working like the Norwegian one, speaking up for children in Jordan. This is what we need to be doing, so we don't have that north-south divide, but so we have local organization. It doesn't matter so much whether they're branded Save the Children. I like them to be, but they don't have to be. The most important thing is that you have a vulnerable group that have a voice that can speak to decision makers and say, hang on, something is not right here.
Don, what's your opinion on this?
So,
do you see a shift from north to south?
Well, absolutely. I think the hashtag shift the power perhaps signifies that. But there's something that the Secretary General said in her speech, that civil society the constant is change. Change is a constant, if I can paraphrase you. I think that is, we all need to reinvent ourselves, and that applies to academia, not least, to make ourselves relevant, to communicate better. But we have to also be aware of what are the criticisms? What are the deficiencies? And here we see a lot of criticisms directed at, well, organizations in the South, if you could say that. It has to do with, sometimes it's not even clear if civil society is embedded in the state. Is it working for the state? Is it against the state? Is it hidden from the state? We can't really see sometimes, in some cases, a differentiated terrain between the state and civil society. And those things need to be addressed. In other cases, just starting an NGO is a sure way of gaining political power in many societies. But there are all kinds of criticisms also against the northern NGOs as well as the southern civil society organizations. Some say that civil society often promotes minimalist change, not really deep social change. One is perhaps too elite, professionalized. How can they represent the marginalized people? There's this kind of a focus on technical fixes, career incentives, drive civil society. So I think the basic thing really here is we all need to change. We need to adapt to the global realities, and that applies to the civil society organizations. But we also need to talk about what is not working, be honest about it, where we are failing. I think the Development Fund, I think a lot of the CSOs are represented here. They talk often about what is not working, and I think that is really great. I think Save the Children Norway has been talking about also what is working, which is great. But we need to operationalize these ideas. I mean, both the Foreign Minister and the Secretary General talked about the leave no one behind. Those things are really nice and appealing, but in reality, it is very vague. And it's not really clear how you're going to operationalize this on the ground. The human rights approach that you mentioned, great, we all agree with it, but just the nitty-gritties, the messy realities is often far more difficult. So I'm really, as much as I like the buzzwords and the appealing rhetoric, we really have to think about asking the following question. How can we reach those that are furthest behind first when we don't know who they are?
Okay, Helle, can you comment on that?
No, but I would like to offer just a part of that answer. I don't have the whole answer, but I think we have some elements of that. First of all, we have to map where they are. We are actually starting to do that. Where are the most deprived children in the world? But I do think that what I was trying to say in my speech has some parts of where they are. Because we need to understand that maybe in the Millennium Goals we were talking about poverty. And we thought that the most deprived children were in the most poor countries, which they are. But the most deprived children of today, they're experiencing a very toxic cocktail of being poor, often, but also being systematically discriminated against because they belong to a different ethnic group or marginalized religion, or because they are disabled, because they are street children, because they are on the move from war conflict, or simply because they are girls. So we have actually got a lens on which to understand that. Is that sharp enough, that lens? Probably not. But I think that is part of the lens to understand who are the most deprived children of this world and really focusing on them.
To Børge, is this lens sharp enough? Do we know enough?
No, I think that's a short answer. And sometimes the focus is also very media driven. That's why I appreciate when we have this focus also on the forgotten conflicts. But we need to be more objective on when it comes to indicators, or we need indicators showing us where are the greatest needs, and we need to be there. But then it's also about access. We have to be honest about that. Look at Yemen today. It was the poorest country in the Arab world, at least in the Gulf. And no, it is a terrible humanitarian catastrophe. But what about the access? And we have other examples of this too. Then I think we also need to, there are so many dilemmas related to this. How much conditions should we put on countries and governments on development? On human rights, if you see it goes in the wrong direction, how tough should we be when it comes to collaboration? And also, what needs to be in place in countries in fragile situations to get them moving? You know, they're fragile in their own way, all of them. But I think there are some things in common. I think one of the things that are in common is that they don't have revenue base. And to create a revenue base, even if it's very small, I think that leads to future development. And then when you first have revenues, you have to make sure that those revenues are also used to the benefit of the people. So they're invested in health and education. And that is really the start of moving out of fragility into a more positive development path. And how can we contribute to that is one of the core questions. And I have some ideas, and we will, as I said, present a white paper this spring where we also will address this. But then if we don't do it right, of course, the media is there. Oh, how can you support in such a country because everything you do will go wrong. You don't have the competence and all this. But can we really then sit there and not do anything in a country because it's difficult when we know the humanitarian needs are really monumental? Should we then go into a country that is much easier and say, oh, there we already have the infrastructure and they're moving now very close to becoming a lower middle income country? That's much easier. It's less risky. That is not the way I would like to move forward. I think we also have to be honest that moving into fragile states comes with a risk. We have to be willing to take that risk, but we have to work with the leading institutions globally how to make this right. That's also important, but we should not shy away from the risk, because then we're shying away from the most vulnerable children and most vulnerable people of the world.
Thank you. Helle, you have a plane to reach. Yes. So, not shy away from risk. So many dilemmas. I think it concludes this little conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, yeah. Yeah.